So, hello everyone, thanks for joining. I just thought I would set up an extra meeting on our calendars so that we could have some dedicated time to talk a little bit about the future direction for the security policies group. I know a lot has kind of shifted around recently, and some engineers are moving over to Threat Insights. So like we now will have, yep, including Brian. Things are shifting around for sure. The new target headcount for this group is actually 2 front-end developers and 3 back-end developers. So although we're transferring some back-end developers out, we're actually going to be opening a position and hiring for a new front-end developer so that Alexander is no longer our only front-end developer. And part of that reflects the fact that, now that we're handing the container scanning category off to composition analysis, it's really going to allow us to focus very heavily on the security policy editor. And there's a lot planned there. So that's what I wanted to kind of cover today, because I really see that as a big value add for customers who are purchasing Ultimate. We see that as a big value driver all the time in deals. I know I shared that quote recently from Samir, who shared, he walked through all of our security features with his customer and they were kind of medium, about all of it. And then he showed them the security policy editor and they got really excited. And that's because this is something that we have that pretty much nobody else has on the market. This is a very unique value proposition. And this is an area where GitLab is really leading the way in terms of innovation, configurability, flexibility, and usability for our customers. So that's really the story for security policies, is we are making these policies easy to use, we're making them understandable, and we're making them comprehensive enough to meet all of our customers' needs. So I wanted to share my screen. Some of this I know we've talked about before, but it's been a long time. And so I think it's probably worth coming back and revisiting some of these topics just to reshare where we're headed. Hopefully here in a minute, you're able to see my screen okay. I'm looking at the direction page for our group. In here, we have this matrix, and this matrix will change slightly because we're actually trying to get rid of the license compliance analyzer, so that will go away. Of course, we've got our scan execution policies. We've got our scan result policies, which we plan on renaming eventually. So kind of the immediate roadmap here is to finish adding support for the other analyzers, make sure that scan result policies are supported at the group level, just kind of filling out those policies that we already have. We're in the middle of working on a rule mode for scan execution policies, things like that. I think you're all pretty familiar with our near-term roadmap. But there actually is a lot to be done beyond that near-term roadmap. And just looking at our priorities page, I took all of the container scanning items out, and we still have 21 items here on our backlog. So we have a very big, very robust backlog. And this is, believe it or not, I actually tried to limit this. So there's more stuff that we can do that I don't put on here, but I try to keep this like at least a little bit constrained as much as I can. So I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the other areas that we might head in the future, and then just kind of open it up for any feedback that you have or questions or anything else here at the end. So once we have scan execution policies really filled out with all support for all the scanners, and scan result policies are a little bit more matured, one of the next things that we want to do is, now that the compliance group is coming over, and we wanted to do this already anyway, it just makes the coordination a little bit easier. We'll want to start merging the compliance frameworks with the security policies. One piece of that will be to add the ability at the group level to filter which compliance frameworks apply for a given project. And then the other piece of that, at the moment, it's further down on the list. Add support for compliance pipelines. So this would be going over to our prototype here. This would be the ability to add an action to just run any generic CI. And the idea is that eventually this would be able to replace what we have today with compliance pipelines, because we would be able to give users the flexibility to run just any arbitrary YAML and enforce that in a pipeline. And that would give us the flexibility that we don't have in the security policy editor today, but it also combines it with the ease of use that you have with the rest of the policy editor. And it also makes it available at the project level, the subgroup level, and the group level. Right now, those compliance frameworks, you can only really apply them at the top group level. So, we've got trade-offs on both sides, and we really want to bring those together and make it one really clean solution for users. Ideally, we haven't done the design for all of this yet, but ideally we would show some of this back on the main page. So this is a top level group where you go to set up these compliance frameworks. And if I click in on here, right now you can only specify the compliance pipeline, but ideally we would push that information back up too. So once you can filter these policies by compliance framework, we would be able to say, for this framework, here are the policies that are going to be applied to this framework. So it'd be kind of a read-only view to be able to have that two-way visibility and see what this framework is doing once you apply it. So again, like those two areas of the product, we see those coming together much more tightly than they are now in a single solution. Another area that we want to really expand on is the usability of policies. So some of this we actually have designed out, I think. So right now, when you create a merge request for a change to the policies, of course, it doesn't show up in this policy list. So it'd be really nice if we could centralize that UI and show, policies that are pending changes, show open merge requests. I think, yeah, Camellia already did a really good job on all of these designs. So this is just in our backlog waiting to be implemented. And then long-term, there's still the open question of where do we want to store all of this, whether that continues to be in Git or hidden in the database. How can we make that storage simpler so that users don't have to think about associating that with a separate project? So this would be one step towards that, because if we do move this to the database, we would still want a way for users to submit changes for approval and show those. And so this would be building out that approval UI as a preliminary step to potentially moving it to the database in the future. Let's see. Other things to think about longer term is just expanding this beyond just scan execution and scan result policies. So those are the two policy types that we've started with, but there's actually a lot more that we can do here. The Threat Insights team is looking at contributing in a new vulnerability management policy type to help automate some of the workflow around vulnerabilities. So basically automatically dismissing a vulnerability or automatically setting a vulnerability to be resolved if it's no longer detected, requiring approval before changing the severity of a vulnerability, or requiring comments when you dismiss something. So they're actually planning to contribute into our group for a lot of those things, although eventually we might build some of that out ourselves as well. And then we have still other policy types, like insider threat type policies. The easiest to understand example here is thinking about malicious user activity in GitLab itself. So if somebody logs in from Texas today and then logs in 5 minutes later from Australia, that would be really suspicious, because in theory, they shouldn't have been able to travel that far of a distance. And so what do you do with things like that at that point? This is kind of where that alert dashboard comes back into play, of generating, alerts of suspicious activity that we're seeing and allowing users to process that. We may also have other automated response actions that come out of this, like block the user from signing in for 10 minutes, or don't allow them to clone any repositories for the next hour while we go triage things, or limit their access to all projects that are tagged as sensitive, things like that might be appropriate precautionary measures when you see suspicious activity. So there'd be specific events. I actually used to work on an insider threat product, so I know a lot about anomalous user activity, but establishing thresholds, like if a user suddenly starts cloning all of the organization's repositories and you see 1,000 clones in the course of an hour, that would be really suspicious. That wouldn't really be normal, expected, ordinary behavior by a person. And it may be that that person is doing something wrong. It also could mean that their credentials have been compromised and a bot is going and doing something on their behalf. And then peer group anomalies, right? Like GitLab is a great place to look at this. As an example, I have access to a whole bunch of projects in GitLab, and most of those I don't even really need access to, but I just have access to them. And so compared to the others in my peer group, like compared to myself versus the rest of the governed stage, or myself versus the other product managers, which projects are those peers normally touching? If I were to suddenly go out and do a lot of activity on a project that none of my peers engage with, again, maybe that's legitimate activity, but it also potentially could be concerning. So there are a lot of advanced, user activity policies as we think about helping to avoid, malicious activity. I suppose, as we really get into Lovable and thinking about the really big picture here, we could do some advanced analysis about the type of code that's being inserted or the number of vulnerabilities that are being introduced. Maybe we could even proactively detect if you suddenly open a merge request with a whole lot of SAST findings, or we're able to detect that there's some sort of malicious code there, maybe your account has been compromised, and that should be raised for further review. And then on the anti-abuse side, so this actually, both of these relate to other groups inside of the SEC section. But on the anti-abuse side would be pipeline policies, specifically pipelines that tend to either contain malware, run malware, or contain crypto mining software, or how do you protect your runners from abuse? And so again, there are a lot of anomalous type activities that we can go through and detect here and create a rules engine for users to determine what's allowed and what's blocked on their instance. And then one other type of policy that's not in here, I suppose that I should mention, just circling back actually to scan result policies. I probably glossed over that one just a little bit too quickly. We do have on our roadmap to bring what is currently license check in to this editor. In fact, we have actual mocks for that. I should show the actual mocks instead of the prototype. So actually, Fernando from the composition analysis team is going to be helping us with the front end on this one. So we'll get a little bit of a boost there development wise, thanks to his help. But this will be introducing a new drop down here in the scan result policies. So you can pick either license scanning or security scanning. If you select license scanning, then the rest of the rule criteria changes so that you can write license type rules. And there's a lot that we can do here as well, because projects can be licensed in pretty complex ways with ands and ors. Even GitLab itself has GitLab Community Edition and then Enterprise Edition. And so depending on the path that you're using, it's licensed differently. And so this is, again, really just the tip of the iceberg and sets up a path for us to then expand on that and support a wide variety of use cases. And then lastly, we don't have mocks for this one, so I'll switch over to the prototype, but we have status check. I don't know if all of you are familiar with that capability in the product, but this would be the ability to potentially block or require approval on a failed status check. So that's, again, something that the compliance team owns and manages, that they've built out in the product. You can see this when you set it up on the merge requests page. You can configure an external API to reach out to, and it will basically wait for that API to reply with either a passed or failed message saying if it succeeded or not. So this is really nice because it's super flexible. Your API can do any kind of logic or custom checks that you care to code in. The way this shows up right now on the merge request itself is we have a separate MR widget for the check. You can see this one's pending because I just called out to an arbitrary URL. So of course it's never going to reply. But right now this replies back either passed or failed, but there's no way currently to block the merge request or require approvals on a pending or a failed status check. So again, ideally this would be integrated with the security policy editor, because this is very commonly being used as a security and compliance gate for merge requests. So again, we see some more collaboration there with the compliance team on the scan result policy side. I just covered a ton of material, but let me stop for a minute. What thoughts, questions, comments, or feedback do you have on that vision and where we're headed with security policies?
I thank you, Sam, for the overview. That is a great look into the future. And I'm excited about all the new policies we're creating. This is a question on something that's very far in the future, but pipeline policies sound like they overlap with monitor alerts a little bit, in terms of like the monitor alerts can alert people to CPU usage and stuff like that. How what are the difference in use cases there?
Great question. So monitor alerts is actually monitoring the customer's production Kubernetes cluster, monitoring that for CPU usage. So it's more of like an infrastructure, IT ops kind of persona that's monitoring to make sure that everything's up and running in production. So we would be monitoring the pipelines, and that's actually more in line with what model ops and anti-abuse, what the anti-abuse team is doing, because they're trying to write rules to detect, especially for GitLab.com, where we've got a SaaS instance, but this applies as well to self-managed users who have public-facing instances of detecting, okay, somebody signed up for a free GitLab account, and now they're using our free pipeline minutes to run a crypto miner software, and they're basically making 50 cents while charging GitLab $10 in CPU time. I'm making up these numbers, but that's generally the idea, as well as malware in general comes into play there as well. Like, we do a good job of isolating those, but we still see things that are malicious in nature, whether they're attempting to host malicious code or call out to malicious services on the dark web. There are like a lot. People are very creative, and if they can find a place to run something for free, there's a good chance that there are people out there trying to abuse it. And so these rules would attempt to curb that abuse and allow users to determine how they want to respond when those things are detected, with the goal being to put that in their hands, because you don't want to just outright block things, because you might end up blocking something that is in fact legitimate. But giving them those controls to define, like, where is that line for them? At what point do they start blocking? At what point do they just alert and then manually follow up? At what point do they rate limit, or like reduce things before just blocking outright, and what things do they completely allow. And so again, this would be focused more on the pipelines, but from an alerts dashboard perspective, like a front end perspective, there definitely is a lot of overlap there. The main difference would just be, again, the same as we encountered before, is just the persona is different. And so you don't necessarily want to see your production monitoring together with your security and compliance monitoring. So it would be essentially the same user experience, just filtered for a different persona to surface up only the alerts that they need.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you.
Yeah, great question. All right. Well, yeah, thanks for letting me talk for so long. I hope this was useful to you. Personally, I'm very excited about our future here and the direction that we're headed. I feel like this is a huge differentiator for the product and for the company as well, and a huge value add for users. I get feedback all the time on this, and it's generally very, very positive. And both on, with all of the capabilities that we've introduced up to this point, we see those as key drivers in many of our ultimate deals. And I expect that that'll be the case continuing forward as well, especially as we expand into some of these other areas. Cool. Thanks for joining today. That's all I have. Hope you all enjoy the rest of your week.
Thank you, Sam.